What is the women's movement? What does it mean to be a woman? Further, what effect on women does living in a patriarchal society have? What tolls does it take, and how? From as far back as 35,000 BC, statuettes of pregnant women have been found in caves, suggesting that early societies were matricentries or female-centered and worshipped female deities. Goddess worship was the norm in ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Western Europe for thousands of years. What brought about the demise of the matricentry? The domination of women by men displaced the goddess and reassigned her role. Gender is represented by the role of a woman as wife, mother, and servant, while a man's role is that of her owner. This is firmly exemplified by familial traditions reaching as far back in history to the putting down of roots, quite literally. The understanding of paternity, the male's involvement in reproduction, transformed us from a long history of matrilineal society to a patrilineal one. This shift is thought to coincide with humans availing themselves of agriculture. The beginnings of wealth that surpluses of food created, and the increased need for labor to maintain the collateral fortuity an agrarian society afforded. Increased labor needs were met by the domestication of animals, and for the first time, woman. With the end to a nomadic life came the domicile and the farm, both requiring labor, and the exploitation and control over a woman's sexuality began. A man's need for ownership of his wife or wives and their offspring gave rise to the patriarchy we live in today. The family, familia with the Latin translation a man and his slaves, had begun to mold the roles of wife, mother, and servant in which women are still actively participating. Alan Johnson defines patriarchy as a system which promotes male privilege, is organized around male-centeredness, male dominance, and in which male members of society and their assigned characteristics are idealized. The antithesis of celebrated maleness is delegated to the role of the female. This provides the basis for a power structure and hierarchy, placing males as the preeminent sex at the expense and subordination of females as inferior. Without the social construct of gender and the requisite roles they imply, the patriarchy would not function as it does, and male dominance would be devalued, and a more equitable relationship between the sexes might exist. While it is evident that historically women had been resisting the oppression of men under the patriarchy, demanding their voices be heard, calling for advancements in gender equality and reproductive agency, it was not recognized as a cohesive effort in the United States until 1848. Led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, this first wave of feminism saw a transformative effort from abolition to a focus on obtaining legal entitlements, including the right to vote for women and reproductive rights. The women's movement is understood to have been officially birthed on July 19, 1848, marked by the first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and attended by a collective 300 men and women. At the end of 2 days filled with discussion and debate, 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments, a gender equality adaptation of the Declaration of Independence, outlining specific grievances and setting an ambitious agenda for the women's rights movement. Further, the Seneca Falls delegation drafts and adopts a set of 12 resolutions calling for both equal treatment of men and women under the law in the arenas of marital, property, and voting rights for women. While the media coverage was predominantly negative, the attention of the press served for a widespread galvanization of the cause and to fuel action which will result in the continued efforts of women and supply cohesion to this new movement. Marches and protests began in earnest all over the country. State by state, amendments are passed, and the women on the front lines of the battle for suffrage see victory. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is signed into law by Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, granting women the right to vote. On other fronts, women continue to struggle for basic health and education. What does it mean to be pro-choice? To Margaret Sanger, it meant defending the rights of women to prevent unintended pregnancy with education and birth control, to choose legal abortion, and to access the prenatal care they needed to have healthy children. The pro-choice movement proved to be gaining ground with the opening of the first birth control clinic in New York in 1916 by Sanger. Sanger started her campaign to educate women about sex in 1912 by writing a newspaper column called What Every Girl Should Know. While working as a nurse on the Lower East Side, a predominantly poor immigrant neighborhood, Sanger treated a number of women who had undergone back alley abortions or tried to self-terminate their pregnancies. Sanger objected to the unnecessary suffering endured by these women, and she fought to make birth control information and contraceptives available. No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother, Sanger said. Her earlier publication and dissemination of family planning tips and practices opened the door for women to begin to insist on their reproductive rights as inalienable. Although the clinic is shut down a mere 10 days later and Sanger is arrested, she eventually wins support through the courts and opens another clinic in New York City in 1923. In her pamphlet, Sanger presents that women appeal in vain for instruction concerning contraceptives. Physicians are willing to perform abortions where they are pronounced necessary, but they refuse to direct the use of preventatives which would make the abortions unnecessary. Sanger's efforts will later coalesce to form Planned Parenthood and help to provide reproductive counseling and education to millions of women. While the war afforded women many economic and employment opportunities, they would not see much in the way of recognition. The munitions industry also heavily recruited women workers, as represented by the U.S. government's Rosie the Riveter propaganda campaign. Based in small part on a real-life munitions worker, but primarily a fictitious character, the strong bandana-clad Rosie became one of the most successful recruitment tools in American history and the most iconic image of working women during World War II. Her we-can-do-it attitude empowered women to get the job done while men were at war. The domestication of women in the 50s sees feminism come to a screeching halt. With men returning from war, women are removed from the workforce where they experience autonomy and are relegated to domestic duties in the home once again. Her role is reestablished as a homemaker, and again women are under man's rule. Barbie, with her unrealistic ideal figure and the domination of women by man via visual depiction, represents the height of patriarchy, the most debasing and the lowest form of identity subjugation. Despite a feminist movement that has been filing away at the shackles for over 100 years at this point, women are still balefully oppressed and collectively taking part in the roles assigned them, often without the awareness of their catastrophic complicity. This is about to be turned on its ear. The second wave of feminism washes ashore in the early 60s on the heels of the Food and Drug Administration's approval of the birth control pill. The passage of the Civil Rights Act, particularly Title VII, barring discrimination in employment on the basis of race and sex, is a boon to the burgeoning women's movement. The publication of Betty Friedan's highly influential book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, describes the dissatisfaction felt by middle-class American housewives with the narrow role imposed on them by a patriarchal society. Friedan writes, "The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask, even of herself, the silent question, is this all?" Friedan's indictment of societal mores with the utterance of "the problem that has no name" gave middle-class white women a voice with which to refute the notion that women could find fulfillment only as wives, childbearers, and homemakers. As simply an extension of man's existence and reality, the problem that has no name was given a name, and second-wave feminists had no problem shouting it out. Gloria Steinem, founder of Ms. Magazine and a key figure in the movement, also showed the same sort of verve and purpose when she said that the women's lib movement would benefit not only the women, but the men of the society as well, by dissolving the sexual stereotypes and expectations. Friedan will go on to found the National Organization for Women, one of the largest and most mainstream organizations of the women's movement in the U.S. Now will increase its numbers from 1,200 in 1967 to 48,000 in 1970. Now seeks to end sexual discrimination, especially in the workplace, by means of legislative lobbying, litigation, and public demonstrations. In 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment is passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification. Originally drafted by Alice Paul in 1923, the amendment reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." January 22, 1973, goes down in modern feminist history as a day marking a giant leap forward for women when the U.S. Supreme Court hands down the landmark Roe v. Wade ruling, in which the court recognized that the constitutional right to privacy encompasses the right to choose abortion. The pro-choice movement is supportive of a woman's right to terminate pregnancy. The term was coined in the years after Roe v. Wade. Advocates adopted the phrase to emphasize the woman's choice and to counter the opposing pro-life movement. The pro-choice lobby believes that mothers-to-be should have access to education, prevention, and be in control over their reproductive systems as a fundamental human right. This has polarized the feminist movement by pitting women against each other, and trends show that the fight to keep abortion legal and uphold Roe v. Wade is in a decline, with less and less support. Hillary Rodham Clinton once said, "I have met thousands and thousands of pro-choice men and women. I have never met anyone who is pro-abortion." Being pro-choice is not being pro-abortion. Being pro-choice is trusting the individual to make the right decision for herself and her family, and not entrusting that decision to anyone wearing the authority of government in any regard. In a society that is equal, without the subjugation of women and their reproduction as a commodity, there would be no need for abortion. Without sexual abuse and with equality in gender, there would be very few unplanned and unwanted pregnancies, and those that arose would equally burden the father as well as the mother. Most women who choose abortion may feel indeed that they had no other choice. In a society that favors men, how can there be a real choice for women? When women refuse to continue to accept the patriarchy, hold men 50% accountable to the domestic duties, parenting, and more reliable childcare, women will begin to carve a new niche for themselves in this society. Third wave feminism began in the 1990s and was a response to the initiatives of the second wave of feminism. Much of the criticism of the second wave centered around the essentialist definitions of femininity and assumed a universal female identity, modeled after upper white middle-class women. This internal backlash to the second wave of feminism is central to the identity of third wave feminists, who subscribe to and are inclusive of queer theory, women of color, transnationalism, post-colonial theory, and ecofeminism. Disillusionment with the traditional white upper-class second wave of feminism has caused a loss in the momentum that the movement once had in the United States, defining women far too narrowly and causing many to feel that feminism is a dirty word that they just don't identify with. Third wave feminists have focused heavily on issues that remain unchanged by both first and second waves of feminism that continue to oppress women, both at home and in the U.S. and globally. Domestic abuse continues to be an unending problem despite the passage in 1994 of the Violence Against Women Act, which tightened federal penalties for sex offenders, provided funds, services for victims of rape and domestic violence, and provided for special training of police officers. The act expired in December of 2012. Physical violence against women is an example of the brutality that women are subjected to keep them in their place. The underlying and constant fear of rape experienced by women is another control tactic used to relegate women to the home and off the streets. The power imbalance that exists between the sexes fosters the women's fear of men. Rape is the ultimate fear espoused by women. Physical and sexual abuse of children, primarily female children, is rampant in our society. All of these acts of violence are acts of power, not acts of sexual nature. Globally, women have organized to revolt against human trafficking of women, child brides, limited education, and lack of marital rights. The horrific abuses of husbands in Islamic countries include the disfigurement of wives and the denial of basic human rights are areas that are radically addressed by women all over the world. The practice of female genitalia mutilation is another issue galvanizing a global effort to bring an end to barbaric patriarchal practices against women. Women all over the globe have mobilized and become active participants in winning their equality. Although the women's movement has been opposed and attacked repeatedly by religion and government in the United States, women continue to fight for equality. The ongoing push by the moral majority to overturn Roe v. Wade has been met head-on by those women who were there to see it passed and those who are just beginning their journey of activism. Women's rights are human rights, and every aspect of a woman's life is just that, her life, regardless of the choices she makes for herself, whether they be regarding her chosen profession, her decision whether to commit her body and life to motherhood, or her choice of how to express her sexuality. She must constantly defend her personal rights to make those choices.